No one knows a neighborhood like the people who live there. So when it comes to financing your new home, a local always knows. LaSalle, the bank that works.
It is very important to explain to children all over America what has happened and to reassure our own children that they are safe.
This is Chicago Tonight, Wednesday, April 21st, 1999.
Good evening, I'm John Calloway, and welcome to Chicago Tonight. 15 dead and more than 20 injured. That is the toll in the worst school violence episode in American history, a tragedy that struck Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado yesterday. Authorities there said today that the investigation into the massacre will be long and that it will be thorough. And one parent told a television news reporter, "If it can happen here, it can happen anywhere." Taking those words seriously, we will talk this evening with 4 experts who have deep experience with the issues of school violence and troubled teens. We'll hear from them after Chicago Tonight correspondent Elizabeth Brackett brings us up to date on the story in Colorado and the reaction here in Chicago.
Columbine High School students dropped flowers at an impromptu memorial outside the school. Shaken as they were, one student said maybe yesterday's day of horror would change behavior.
Maybe this could bring about people actually doing something about, discriminating at school and making fun of people. Maybe there are people that take a stance against this and all this hurt and pain, because this is what it does. This is what happens. People just lose it.
Bodies of the 2 students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who allegedly caused the carnage, were found in the school library. The question of motive went unanswered, but clues were found on Eric Harris's America Online website. This recreation of his profile shows yesterday's message. "Today is my last day on Earth. Be prepared." Law enforcement officials retrieved bags of evidence, including computer equipment, from the Harris home. Other officers returned to the home and could be seen talking to Harris's father and brother. The investigation continued at the school as well. Officials say the boys may have had accomplices.
It's very, very possible. Last night we found an excessive amount of new bombs in the school, and the number is over 30 right now.
Over 30 explosives.
Over 30 explosives, and we did have one detonate last night as the officers were trying to move it at about 11 o'clock.
The large number of bombs prevented the removal of the victims' bodies. The tragedy prompted President Clinton to speak out on violence.
We also have to take this moment once again to hammer home to all the children of America that violence is wrong. And parents should take this moment to ask what else they can do to shield our children from violent images and experiences that warp young perceptions and obscure the consequences of violence.
Well, no one here at Lane Tech High School in Chicago says a tragedy like the one that occurred in Colorado couldn't happen here. Most students do say they feel safe in their school. Like at every Chicago high school, 2 uniformed police officers patrol the halls. And at Lane Tech, there are an additional 19 unarmed security officers with handheld metal detectors.
I would almost say 100% that it won't happen at Lane, and it couldn't, because of all the precautions that they take. When we walk in early in the morning, we get here so early, there's already security posted in the hallways. You walk in, they see you, they recognize you, but they still ask you for where you're going, all your identifications, like your ID, why are you here so early, everything. They try to take every precaution that's necessary for your safety.
Assistant Principal Keith Foley says security is a top priority at Lane Tech, which did not appear to be the case in suburban Littleton.
There probably shouldn't be a difference, but I think big cities are more safety conscious They're more involved in having security be a priority. And I think we can see that from the unfortunate tragedies that we've had in the last few years, that they haven't been in urban areas.
Lane Tech students also say they do not think kids who act or dress differently would be teased or isolated here. Harris and Klebold were described as members of the trenchcoat mafia who always wore black and were angered by insults from other students.
Well, one thing about Lane Tech is a very diverse school. We have a lot of everything here, so you're going to find a school of over 200 people. Everyone isn't going to be the same person, everyone's different or whatever. And I guess because we're used to that here, we're used to seeing so many different people, so many different backgrounds, different cultures, different groups and everything. When we see things like that, I mean, some people may have their comments, but we're used to it.
The students differed on the impact of violent television and movies on behavior.
You can't blame it on TV or movies because we all grow up watching TVs and we all go to the movies and whatever. Our parents tell us, what's right and what's wrong. And if you watch the movies and watch TV, that's, that it's fake and everything.
The world that you live around and what you're surrounded by does affect you to an extent. Maybe it won't make me want to go kill someone, but yeah, I can say kids are, and this has happened in elementary schools as well, so we shouldn't limit out kids that are even younger, like 9 or 10 years old.
But as in Colorado and across the nation, these students could not really fathom why two teenagers would resort to such violence. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Elizabeth Brackett.
And now joining us are Dr. Catherine Coffer-Christoffel, professor of pediatric and preventive medicine at Northwestern University School of Medicine and an attending pediatrician at Children's Memorial Medical Center in Chicago. And she's medical director of the Handgun Epidemic Lowering Plan Network. That's a national network of medical and allied organizations working to reduce gun injuries, especially among children. Dr. Robert Gallitzer-Levy, who is child and adolescent psychoanalyst and psychiatrist at the Institute for Psychoanalysis and also a member of the faculty at the University of Chicago, and he is the author of the book, The Essential Other. Richard Curwin, a San Francisco-based consultant doing Discipline with Dignity workshops around Illinois, sponsored by the Illinois State Board of Education. He's written 14 books on aggression and violence in children, including As Tough as Necessary, and perhaps his best-known book, Discipline with Dignity. And Douglas Brindlin, a family therapist who's vice president at the Family Institute at Northwestern University, and he's also a consultant to Lyons Township, helping develop their anti-violence program called Peaceable Schools. And welcome all to Chicago Tonight. Mr. Curwin, I'll start with you. Major crime categories, particularly in big cities, are down dramatically over the last several years. I think juvenile crime in some categories is down, and yet, am I mistaken, or is there an epidemic, and is this particular story we're talking about a really new dimension with all the planning and the bombs, not to mention the guns?
Well, I guess I'm more surprised that there aren't more incidents like this instead of how few there are. Kids today have almost no remorse for what they do, and when kids feel no remorse, there's no way to control their behavior. I'm not sure if it's an epidemic or it's just contagious, because violence breeds violence. And when people are violent to others, the response is always a violent return back to someone. And what I guess is happening in many cases is when parents are violent with their children, the children are violent with each other.
Are you saying then that if we really examine the hearts and minds, that there are a lot of kids who probably have many of the same symptoms or problems or coming to the background, etc., maybe who just didn't, who haven't done anything, but they're still in just as much pain, say, as the kids
what I'm saying.
involved?
There's a lot of people that are hurt, there's a lot of people that are angry, and these come in many different ways. Some go to extremes and planning things like this, but they don't usually do them. I think many kids plan these incidents. It's very rare that they actually ever happen, but when they do, they wake everybody up.
Dr. Christoffel, is there something new going on, or is this the same old story magnified?
Well, I think both. The same old part is that we have kids who are in pain, in trouble, who haven't been able to get the kind of help that they need to deal with their problems in more constructive ways, and they use terribly violent means that they have access to wreak havoc. That part's sort of old. The new part is that it seems to be an escalation, the planning, the use of the bombs in addition to guns, they've outdone their predecessors. And I think unless we have a consistent way of helping kids and preventing their access to deadly weapons, we will see an escalating pattern like this.
Dr. Callister-Levy, what's your take on this story in that respect? How are we overdoing it, or is this really a major thing to keep an eye on?
It's a very major thing to keep an eye on, but I think it's a tip of an iceberg in the sense that what we're hearing about is kids in enormous pain, in enormous difficulty. They're all over the place. They aren't just in this one small community. They aren't here and there. Now, there is a major difference now. One is that kids are more separated from the rest of society than they've ever been in the past. You go into McDonald's and you don't see kids working with other adults. You see kids working with kids supervised by another kid a couple of years older.
So in other words, we're not out on the farm with mom and dad anymore.
No, we're not involved. It doesn't have to be on the farm, but it has to be involved with the broader society.
And that's new.
That's new.
How new is it? I mean, to me, I've been seeing that for several years.
It's present for several years, but it's growing and growing. It's more true now than I think it was a decade ago, more true than 50 years ago. Of course, the other piece of it is, no matter how you're feeling inside, if you have a gun with which you can kill a bunch of people, the end of the story is completely different.
And not to mention, I'm going to reinforce it tonight, bombs, because that's another part. Douglas, what's your take on this?
Well, the carnage and the destruction jump out as outrageous, but what seems to capture the attention of many of the commentators and in the opening is the way in which two students who look very much like any other students attending this school could feel so different and choose to isolate themselves in such a devastating way. And what is it about the way our youth feel about themselves that makes this happen?
Mr. Curwin, if you were appointed by the governor of Colorado or even the President of the United States to be on a commission to look into this, what are the things that you would insist that they really take a hard look at that perhaps we don't know enough about yet or haven't paid enough attention to or publicized enough?
There are two things that we do with children that have been now pretty much clear don't work. And they form the foundation of how we discipline children in schools and at home, and I do everything possible to either minimize them or get rid of them, and that's rewards and punishments. They make things worse instead of better.
Rewards and punishments.
Yes.
We've got that wrong?
I think so. That's my basic opinion. Because rewards teach children that the only time I should be good is when someone gives me something, and punishments teach children that if I don't get caught, it doesn't matter what I do.
And do we see that reinforced not only in homes but in schools?
Everywhere. Every system is, if you don't do what I say, this is what's going to happen to you. You're either going to lose something good or get something bad. These have a positive effect on most of the kids who are basically centered and feel comfortable with themselves and are connected to someone else. But they do nothing for the kids that aren't. They just make them more defiant, more alienated, more angry.
What would you replace it with?
I would replace them with teaching them skills so they can know how to manage their behavior, role models so they can see the things that we tell them that are actually done. In our country today, we keep telling kids what to do, but we never do it ourselves.
Well, what if you're talking about kids that walk into what you think is a teaching environment, but they walk in already badly damaged, and they go home at night to a dysfunctional family where their damage is sustained?
I won't give up on kids like that because research tells us that every kid has a chance. In fact, there was a study done of kids that were labeled really dysfunctional kids in school who became successful. And when they were asked what changed their life, they said two things: teachers who cared, and no matter how stubborn I was to make them give up on me, they were more stubborn not giving up on me. That's what made a difference. People who refused to give up on them no matter what they did.
If you were on that commission, what would you insist as a couple of things that they simply wrestle with if we're going to try and deal with these issues?
Well, in terms of information, we need to know where the kids got the weaponry. Whose guns are those? How did they compile an arsenal without anybody noticing? We need to understand the how as well as the why. But
I also not only the guns, but the bomb materials, right?
But I also would insist that only some of the attention of this hypothetical commission be put toward study. The other part has to be put toward planning starting today with the available information.
And what would you
I would
plan?
like to see every school in the country have a detailed plan by the beginning of the school year next year that will do at least two things. One is to identify kids who are in trouble early from a helping perspective, not from the perspective of, I got to find the kid in here who's likely to kill me, but instead we're here to help kids. Let's find kids who need help and go about it systematically. And the other is a foolproof plan to keep guns out of the schools. We wouldn't have any tigers in schools, and people would not have trouble planning ways to make sure that that's the case. If we just go about it methodically, this can be done, and it must be done.
So that the picture after your world was created and improved, the picture in Elizabeth's opening piece would include 19 security people at Lane Tech and a couple of police officers, but maybe 19 counselors working with people, or maybe
that's right.
23.
And the one thing that troubled me the most in the opening segment was the president's focusing on the kids' responsibility. We have to tell the kids that violence is wrong. Well, they've all been told that, and to me, the people we need to talk to are the adults. To help the kids and take care of the kids, and we need to be in a helping perspective. Another thing he said yesterday was we're going to do everything necessary to help the school recover from this disaster. Well, I want to hear him say we're going to do everything necessary to make this the last one. We're going to go for broke and make sure that we have a plan starting now.
He said something else that's very interesting that really, really struck me. I think people, what we tell kids to do, we have to do ourselves. He started off yesterday by saying we have got to teach children to negotiate and not use weapons.
Yeah,
the next news story was Costco.
Exactly.
Dr. Gallitzin-Levy, if you were on that commission, what would you really encourage them, if you could make a couple of lasting recommendations?
In addition to the gun issue, which I think is absolutely central, the next issue is that these kids were not ordinary kids. These kids were had labels on them saying, "I'm in trouble. Something's wrong."
Are you talking about the black trench coat thing and the standoffishness,
They were walking
etc.?
around the school saying, "I'm in trouble," and the school wasn't responding to that.
Now, I've heard younger people on our staff today say in these big high schools that that's not all that unusual. And
that's exactly right. It's
not
right? all that unusual, and that's what's wrong. We have a bunch of kids who are in serious trouble, who the schools are ignoring until they come to attention through something enormously tragic like this. For every kid who's has a tragic outcome like this, there are probably thousands who are not getting anything out of school, who leave the classroom feeling defeated, undignified, lowered in their self-esteem, and they may not kill someone, but they're hurting, they're enraged, they're depressed.
And you're saying we know this, that they're short of neon signs saying, "Help me, help me." If you're in the least bit observant, you can know. If you're a school teacher, administrator, or even a fellow student, you probably know.
You can often know, and this case certainly points to that. There was nothing obscure about the difficulty these kids were in.
Mr. Bellin, what would you tell the Commission that if they got nothing else done on these issues to focus on a couple of things?
Well, I think that the prevention of violence and the creation of peace are two sides of the same coin, and that we need to spend a lot of time understanding how to stop violence, but I also think we need to make our schools, our families, and our society more peaceable.
And you are a part of this Peaceable Schools initiative that you've been working with, among others, Lyons Township.
Lyons Township.
Give us a paragraph or two on that.
Well, it's a simple concept, really, and I think in the opening segment there were many references to the feelings about diversity in the school, for instance, that there was a feeling of hatred toward minorities and perhaps the athletes. To the extent that students do not understand and learn how to get along with one another, appreciate difference, and respect one another, they are prone to the violence.
So that can be taught in workshops and things?
Well, I think it can be taught in workshops, and I think it's absolutely essential.
Is that the kind of stuff you're doing out at Lyons?
Yes, indeed. That's one major part of it. Conflict resolution skills, which Rick alluded to, can be taught in high school.
So in other words, in this case, out in Littleton, Colorado, a teacher or administrator or somebody could have said in a meeting, you know, we got these kids going around, you know, they're part of the so-called trenchcoat mafia, etc. Let's really listen to them and see what's going on, and let's bring them together with some other kids and see what happens, and get them to talk.
And in the process, asking them to talk would show them the respect that they needed. These kids evidently felt that they were tremendously disrespected, that they were valueless, not worth anything. And although we can't say for sure, a lot of people become enraged and violent precisely at the moment where they feel devalued. Simply saying, you're important enough that I want to know what's going on. You're important enough that I will talk to you seriously.
The very act of listening is something. Now, tell us about your... I'm sorry.
Just for 1 second.
Yes.
People who ignore it shout louder, and people who really ignore it shout the loudest. And sometimes people scream just so they'll be heard. Those two men who dragged that man in Texas, one wrote a letter to the other saying, well, we might lose this case, but at least we'll be noticed.
Now tell us about what we've got the camera your way. You've been doing Discipline with Dignity workshops around the state of Illinois. Correct. What is that about that relates to this story?
Well, you mentioned the concept of dignity. The idea is to give dignity to people even when they do bad things, that they're still worthwhile people and they can change. So just because someone does something wrong doesn't mean we have to make them feel alienated and exclude them. The main purpose of the program is to teach kids how to be responsible and make good decisions as opposed to being obedient and doing what they're told. The key factor of any program of behavior is what do kids do when no one's watching and they can do whatever they want. That's how you can tell if a program's going to work or not. And we try to get kids to make good decisions based on their values instead of rewards and punishments.
And you do this in workshops after school?
We do this in training for the faculty.
Oh, training for the faculty.
And for administrators and for parents frequently. And we teach them how to take incidents in school as learning possibilities or learning opportunities instead of disruptions.
We have these health clinics in schools and we have counselors, etc. But somebody suggested that there's as much mental illness to be found in these schools as there is physical illness, and that we should have school-based clinics that acknowledge that. Is that a fair generalization?
Well, I think there's many ways to meet kids' emotional needs, but the observation that kids suffer as much from mental and emotional distress as from physical, probably more.
And what do you want to do? What specifically do you want to see happen on the gun control front?
Well, I think there needs to be broad understanding that the last thing a kid needs if they're in trouble is access to a gun. You know, when people say the gun doesn't do this by themselves, that's true, but there are people in trouble, there are people who are angry, there are people who are depressed, and having that access to the guns the way we do in this country, like no other country in the world, is just fueling deadliness where there could be simply problems that could be dealt with. Those kids are dead. We can't help them anymore. So what we want is recognition that we need to work at both parts. We need to reduce the risk factors for violence along the lines of what we're talking about, and we need to reduce the access that people have, particularly people in difficulty, particularly young people in difficulty, to deadly means.
And do parents need to be held responsible? Is that a part of the fabric of gun control?
I think, well, I don't use gun control. I talk about gun injury prevention. Because the idea is not controlling, but rather enabling people to live full lives without this terrible threat. Parents need to take responsibility for helping their kids. Gun owners need to take responsibility for people not getting access to their guns. Communities need to take responsibility for not having guns pouring into them. All of the adults in the community need to take responsibility for rearing kids whose needs are met. So yes, I think parents have some responsibility, but they don't have sole responsibility. Kids do live in a village.
Yes.
We're going up and down a ladder here, talking about specific kids and their mental state. We're talking about families and the way kids fit into families. We're talking about schools and the way school climate affects the way a kid responds in his or her development. And I think we have to talk about communities too. And I just don't think it's possible to isolate this down to one level. And I think we have to think about interventions at all the levels.
All right, but on that, I just want to touch on, I know you're mostly here tonight to talk about the psychological issues and so on and so forth, but is it fair to say that one of the lessons that we could learn from this episode is that if you were, say, you see the opening piece and you see Lane Tech and the two cops and the metal detectors and the 19 security people and so on and so forth. I have mixed feelings about that, by the way, seeing all of that. But now let's say you're the superintendent or school board out there in one of the suburbs, and you don't have metal detectors. And quite frankly, you're happy you don't have metal detectors, and you're not particularly interested in starting metal detectors. Should you get them anyway? What do you think? Should all schools today have metal detectors and police on the grounds?
I don't think so. I mean, I believe that the climate of violence can breed a climate of violence, and that the concept of a metal detector sends a very strong message to kids that they can't make responsible decisions.
Metal detectors don't work in an unsecured building. so they can't get through the front door, so they bring them in the window. If I saw a metal detector in a school and I knew the kids had guns, I might think, well, gee, I better have a gun too, because what if someone tries to shoot me? We have a mentality that says if you have a gun, somebody won't shoot you. But the truth is, if I want to hurt somebody and now someone has a gun, they're the one I'm going to shoot first.
We'll continue over credits. I see our time is up. Our many thanks to Dr. Catherine Kaufer-Christoffel, Dr. Robert Gallitzer-Levy, Richard Curwin, and Douglas Brenlin for being with us this evening. What media influences might be involved in the Littleton, Colorado tragedy? On our program tomorrow evening at 7 and 10, we'll discuss that and other major media controversies, including the Sun-Times editorial calling for the dismissal of radio shock jock Mancow Muller and the $50 million wrongful death suit against the Jenny Jones show. Join me, Sun-Times columnist Richard Roper, WGN talk show host Judy Markey, Father Michael Flager, and constitutional law expert Daniel Polsby for that debate here on Chicago Tonight tomorrow evening. I'm John Calloway. Thank you and good night.
Now, I don't think we should rule out metal detectors. I think each school needs a plan that reflects the situation in that particular school. And it may be that in some schools you need to secure the building and have metal detectors.
What did you want?
Yeah, but I think the trouble is that doing that creates a prison atmosphere in many schools. And people who are in prison act like prisoners. They don't feel dignified. They don't feel that they should be controlled.
Produced in Chicago by WTTW. This evening's presentation of Chicago Tonight is made possible by the LaSalle Banks.